Morning, everyone. Thanks all for coming. When I was last on stage on Tuesday, and the audience here were very, very nice, we weren't talking about open banking, but today we are. It's probably the most interesting topic that I've covered of late, and I couldn't be happier to be with two of the best people in the business to talk about it, in Claire and Hiroki. But what is open banking, and why should we care? And I think we probably should try and do some defining of that. Maybe Claire, would you like to help us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Open banking is what's happening today in the financial services. There is a radical shift of some of our business model. We've been used to produce financial product by yourself and to distribute them on our platforms. And currently, these business models are evolving towards two new business models, what we call bank as a service. And Nigel have touched on it around embedded finance. Everything that goes by providing to some other companies some parts of what is a bank, but without them becoming a bank, and bank as a platform, which are massive transformation, mostly led by some of the GAFAs or some major companies that are retaining their clients through this platform. So that's these two business models that we are talking about.
Yeah.
Do you agree, Hiroki?
Well, no, I mean, I agree with all that, but I think, maybe look at it from a slightly different perspective. I think the way that I look at open banking and what makes me really excited about it is that in much the same way that over the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've been seeing more and more of our lives being connected to the internet and being able to sort of unlock a lot of potential as a result of that. So, if you think of things like location data and, being able to find your way around using Google Maps or book an Uber and get, a taxi to come to you wherever you are, I think that's what's happening with open banking, right? We're finally going to be able to connect our financial lives and our financial data to the other services that we're using online. And I think that's going to unlock a whole wave of different innovation across a huge amount of different use cases. So we're super, super excited about this.
For sure. The panel here today is about open banking in the wider world, and I think that if you'd asked people 5 years ago about open banking, and I think I'm right in saying GoCardless was founded 2016?
No, we were founded in 2011. We've been around for almost 10 years. Oh, no, sorry,
I'm mistaken. But even so, the idea of that conversation previously was maybe a bit more theoretical, I guess, or at least there wasn't the same application. Now we're seeing financial data being used in all kinds of ways by all kinds of companies across, not just in Europe, where PSD2 originated, in Australia, but also now in the US as well. Can you talk about a few of the sort of main examples that you see that you've been developing on in the ways in which we use open banking that have either changed or that consumers are really reacting to differently?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting, right? Because open banking as a concept has been something that everyone's been talking about for the last 5 years or so, right? It was introduced about 5 years ago. And a lot of the early use cases have been focused on the data side of things, right? So things like being able to connect your bank account to your accounting platform so that you can automate all of your reconciliation, or being able to apply for a loan and giving the lending provider better data to make more informed decisions. It's all been on that kind of side of things. But what we've seen over the last year or so is that there's a real maturity in the platforms underpinning all of these initiatives, which are opening up access to payments. And it's still relatively early in that, right? I think if you take the UK as an example, the UK is probably at the forefront of open banking around the world. And right now it's about 2.5 million transactions a month, right? So still very early, but growing very fast. And we're starting to see some really interesting use cases around things like the HMRC, for example, in the UK, that the tax authority starting to accept payment this way. That saved a huge amount of money for the taxpayer in payment fees. And they've collected over £1 billion in tax just this year through these open banking platforms. So, so we think payments is still relatively early, but we're super excited about it. But some of the kind of use cases that we're seeing in our kind of early efforts is around some of the kind of payment use cases that have been very manual up until now, right? So for example, B2B as a good example, right? B2B payments is still a very, very manual mechanism. Usually you're doing bank transfers. In the US, it's still 60% paper checks. And so really manual processes, really painful. And what we're seeing is, that being unlocked with open banking and enabling, real-time, fast payment, directly from one bank account to another, and that automates a lot of those kind of manual processes. So we think over time, these kind of open banking channels are going to affect all kinds of payments, right? Like all the different types of payments that we see in the world. But we think it's going to be a gradual journey, and it's going to start in specific places. And B2B is a good example of where we're seeing initial traction. But I think it's going to go from use case to use case.
Absolutely. And Claire, you are the executive, the head honcho of Trésor in France. Can you talk a little bit about some of the sort of different use cases that you're seeing? And specifically, I'm interested in, are consumers adopting open banking now in a way that perhaps they weren't previously, and how exciting is that to be a part of?
No, definitely, I share a lot of what Hiroki have said. 5 years ago, it was still a concept, and it was much in terms of the use case around sharing basic data, such as locating your ATM or the payment transaction data. And I remember I was living in the UK for 10 years, and it was the beginning of setting up the open banking working group, and then the regulated entities that facilitated the sharing of the data. And since then, really a long journey I've been. I'm actually not sure the UK is still the leading place in that, because when I look at Trésor, for example, which Société Générale acquired in 2018, and was actually created in 2016, it provides today about 80 different neobanks, financial services system, all their account management, payment systems, sharing infrastructure, without them becoming a bank. And for us, we categorize that as one of the business model, which is bank as a service, so one of the business model of open banking, of platforms. Because what does this, entail for the future of financial services? That entails that actually hotels, for example, when you go and you want to go at the checkout of your hotel, currently it's a pain point where you have to wait, 10 minutes, provide your card, provide your identity. Actually, with, some partnerships with Trésor, hotels can basically have a loyalty card, which everything is embedded, your identity, your KYC is actually done on it, and you can just walk literally in the hotel and even open your hotel room with your mobile. So we're assisting in a full shift on, embedded finance, on, unlocking all the facilities, the infrastructure, the data which is around it, to embed it in other value chains. And that generates a network effect, because in Trésor, as we have 80 different clients, some of them are neobanks, such as Shine and Conto in France, but some others are just payment facilities, for example, for electric vehicles, where you just need to recharge, payment facilities and augmented payments that go with it, and all the data and transaction you can have. Some other use case around these corporates that may want to integrate the bank in a box, or cards, where you have additional services in the card, such as paying for your lunch and doing different areas around. And where Hiroki is totally right is all the data that we capture in this ecosystem then is shared between the different partners. All the innovation is shared between the different partners. And this type of business model are progressively extending all their reach, all their platforms across multiple vertical, multiple industry. And now, as I mentioned, in Trésor, we have more than 80 clients. We're in 4 or 5 countries. Trésor have some competition. We've just talked about Railsbank, but also Solaris Bank, that you may know, that is a German company. And clearly, for us, we often talk with Nigel and Roland, who are the CEOs. We see the market who is so big that there is no limitation. And you will talk just after us with the Russian guys in Sberbank, and Russia also have a very specific approach to aggregating data and aggregating tax data and other type of things. So that's an area where it's a natural relay for retail banking to grow. The most challenging one, as I mentioned, is the bank as a platform one. So we've seen some embryonic play in retirement platforms, where you have different type of services, not only financial services, but actually the ability to plan for your financial life, to plan for your retirement. BBV have produced some application around, for example, planning for your baby, planning for your family. So we are seeing some beginning of play, but here what is harder in the platform play is you need a large reach of customers. And when you look at SocGen, we have 22 million of retail customers worldwide, so it's huge, but it's also nothing compared to the 7 billion that GAFAM may have. So it's a big play and a big data play.
Absolutely. And I just want to touch on some of the, I guess, the infrastructure behind some of this, Hiroki, because you are very plugged into the London and the UK market, but also globally as well. Have you been impressed by some of the applications that you've seen, not just within GoCardless, but that have been facilitated by not just the infrastructure that you guys have been building, but the open banking infrastructure generally in the UK and elsewhere? Has it been really fascinating to see that ecosystem grow, not just within fintech, but around it as well?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. I mean, I think that we've already touched on some of the kind of examples, right? You know, being able to power tax payments and save taxpayers money, that's really great. Being able to connect your data and automate a lot of the kind of very manual processes that used to happen in the accounting department. Those kind of things. It's really great. I think what we're seeing though that's very interesting is that. This is something that's happening all around the world, right? But all on slightly different timelines. So you've got the UK, Europe were kind of ahead of the pack, being driven by PSD2 and sort of more of a regulatory approach. You've had other countries like Australia and New Zealand that are kind of starting to introduce their version of open banking, and in some ways are doing it better than the way that we're doing it in Europe. And then you've got other places like the US where it's being much more of a kind of a market-led approach. And so I think what's going to be really interesting to see is how does this play out on a global basis? Because I think for it to be truly valuable, it can't be just constrained to specific markets. It needs to be something that is broadly applicable. And I think both within the context of different geographies, but even within a given country, I think what's been very interesting to see is that, take the UK as an example, the biggest banks, they've plugged in, right? The open banking, you can interact with your accounts, but then there's a lot of smaller banks that haven't done that yet, right? And I think that's going to create some challenges because for this to be something that is ubiquitous, it needs to be available to everyone. And definitely something that we've seen in some of the early feedback that we've had from our products is, okay, well, it's great that 80, 90% of my customers can pay this way, but what about the 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 where there's no way of doing this, right? What happens then? And so I think that, whilst there's a lot of great things that are happening, I think there's still a long way to go as well. So, I think we're still in the early phases, I'd say.
Absolutely. And on that point around regulation, Claire, I mean, you are representing bank here today. I feel like in the past when I would ask people in the fintech space vis-a-vis the traditional banking space, there was a little bit of a reluctance around open banking, I think, to begin with. People weren't sure how it was going to play out. There's this idea that, banks are very, risk averse in that sense. But the regulatory shift has meant that that's changed a lot, I think, in the past 5 years or so. When you look at somewhere like the US, for example, where, as Hiroki mentioned, it is more market-led, do you think that's something that sort of financial institutions are more willing to understand now and more willing to put time into than perhaps previously, or has it actually always been a continuous process?
I think Callum is very nice because actually what he didn't say is that in France there was a huge storm in a teacup around open banking with one of the financial services representatives of the federation in France saying that actually didn't believe in open banking. So we're just like, oh, you didn't believe in open banking, you didn't believe in PSD2, but like everything has been agreed. And this movement is definitely going ahead, and in Société, at least it's been part of our strategy for a little while. So that's true that I think there is still some belief around is it right for the customer, is it right for the system? And some of the challenge currently on the implementation of open banking, to be very concrete, are around the cost for fintech to comply with compliance and risk integration. So, most of the APIs are now available. In Société, we have more than 2,000 APIs that are available. We expose them externally in our portals. But, sometimes you lack standards. So, the standards of the UK are different than the standard of France. We know we operate 7 retail banks across the world. We have Russia, Africa, Romania, Czech Republic. they all have their different APIs and their standard to expose it. And on top of that, when you have a fintech, you have to, especially for the UK, you have to get the aggregation, and this means that you have to operate at a certain level of security in order to protect the customer data. And that's totally right, because at the end of the day, we are a financial services system, and we are here to protect all this customer data. But the question is, how can we make all this integration of the infrastructure quicker. And that's why Hiroki is saying we are only at the beginning. I'm a little bit optimistic because for me, I work in a big bank, and today it's part of our strategy, validated directly by the board of Société Générale in terms of bank as a service and bank as a platform. So it's very concrete for us. It's been announced back in 2017 in our ID, so it's not a concept anymore, and something very real where we see definitely that if we are not playing on this area, we will not be present in retail banking in the next 10 years, so we have to get there. But there is a lot of pitfall around how can we consume these APIs very seamlessly, how can we make the cost of compliance and risk accessible for everyone to unleash all this innovation. And we didn't solve for that yet, and it's a complex problem.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, by the way, because what we're seeing is, you have very, very different attitudes across different banks. So SocGen, for example, very forward-looking, leaning into open banking, very clearly part of the strategy. Other banks see it much more as like a compliance thing, right? We have to do it. And I think what's quite interesting to see is that when you look at the markets where this is being driven from a regulatory point of view, there tends to be a bit more of a compliance attitude from the banks, not universally, but in general. Whereas in the more market-led approaches, it's being done very much more bilaterally, to the kind of cost of standards and making it a more open sort of system. But I think we need to find a balance between the two, right? Because right now, the banks are having to invest a lot in this infrastructure, but there's no clear way of being compensated for it, right? And so I think that's kind of one of the areas that's probably going to be the next area to explore is, okay, well, how do you make this a sustainable system for everyone involved, including the banks? And I think that's going to be really important to the long-term success of this.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly why I was saying, at the end of the day, it's a movement we've seen in other industries, such as energy or telecommunication, where the infrastructure actually was owned by the sector, and we had to find ways to compensate for everyone to use the cable, to use the energy system in order to open. And I think this movement, and this is what you and I are saying, is definitely in place, and it's moving forward, but how do we work through it? And that's why some of the reason of being market-led have its advantage, because we were saying earlier about some of the use case. One of our company portfolio in SG Ventures is called Fintech, and is doing payment initiation in the website and enabling to get the cash quicker and different things. This can only work because open banking is there, because you can initiate the payment from BNP Paribas, Société Générale, Lloyds Banking Group, Barclays, or even GoCardless or different things. So as the use case adoption is getting quicker, finding the right use case that has the real business plan is what's going to drive the adoption, and it's going definitely to be market-led at the end.
Yeah. It would be remiss of me during the global Panasonic to not mention the big C word, and that's not my name or yours, Claire. It's COVID. It's been, I think, probably written by idiot journalists like me and many others that digitization has really boomed during the pandemic, and it's been a real driving factor in some of that financial service change. And we talked about that adoption. I just wanted to get both of your thoughts, maybe Hiroki first, just on the impact that the pandemic has had on maybe just the fact that people aren't going to bank branches, aren't doing as many manual processes as before, and maybe are more cognizant of their financial data, perhaps by dint of looking at their phones more. Yeah,
I think that's absolutely right. And you can see that in the numbers. The number of open banking transactions is skyrocketing, and that is being driven in part by this shift to everything being done in the cloud, being done digitally. We've seen that for sure firsthand. During the pandemic, some of our customers really struggled. They had to shut down, but a lot of them used that as an opportunity to, look at how they're running, their businesses, how they do their administration, how do they, bring things to the cloud. And so we feel like we've seen a very big sort of acceleration in that general trend towards the cloud. And I think that going back to the initial point about what is open banking, it's about how do you connect your finances to the rest of the internet. How do you connect them to the cloud? And so, I think that we're just seeing that accelerate more and more through the pandemic, and that definitely feels like it's a shift that has been a permanent one, right? It's not just a sort of a temporary acceleration during the pandemic. It's something that's, we're seeing through the other side of it as well.
Does that chime with you, Claire?
Yeah, no, but definitely agree. If we just look at the market, we've seen some amazing moves, such as, the valorization of PLED Plaid was creating what, even after GoCardless, and like, what is, the valuation for the transaction was like 5 billion with Visa. I mean, like, that's massive, so clearly it's becoming now a massive play. It have reality, it's integrated part of the strategy. We've seen some, it's driven definitely by the shift of e-commerce as well. I was talking about companies like Fintech, some of the use case of GoCardless. I'm looking at Trezor and seeing how much this market have definitely grown. And we are seeing that, all the platformization of banking, all what we used to call the Uberization of banking is definitely happening. Now, all the challenges will be, as I mentioned, around the integration and how do we keep the environment of financial services the most secure possible. How do we unleash the innovation? That companies like Plaid, but also, we've seen Stripe doing treasury as a service coming, and a lot of companies starting to do that. But we need to maintain all the cyber risk, all the data protection, which is around it.
For sure. Hiroki, you said that this shift is here to stay, but I'd be interested to sort of get your thoughts on perhaps what you think is coming next. There's been a whole wave of adoption, innovation in this space as it's matured, but do you have sort of any particular crystal ball thoughts about what's next? Is it the metaverse, perhaps? Like, is that evolved?
You promised to get in there. Yeah, I mean, look, we're probably a little bit biased, right? But I think that the future, from our perspective, is very much around payments. Like, that feels like the big kind of use case that and the killer app for open banking. So for us, we're investing very heavily in this. We see it as a big part of the future of our company is leveraging all of these open banking capabilities to get access to a wider variety of bank payment rails, and we think that's going to create a much more compelling value propositions for a far wider variety of payment use cases. So, right now, open banking payments are still very much focused on quite specific use cases, right? We think that's going to proliferate over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So, I think that's going to be the big kind of focus for us, but also we think for open banking in general.
It's very clear that we are on the brink of a shift of a full infrastructure. If we elaborate on the payments,
exactly.
In Société, we're also working a lot in digital assets and everything around how can we tokenize, how can we modernize the payment infrastructure as much, through a startup SG Forge and through the stablecoin, and how can we operate, better some of these payment rails, payment systems. So that's definitely when there is a huge use case, but it's going to be long as well, because it's going to take time to fully digitize this infrastructure and transform it. There are other use cases around cards, other use cases around bank-in-a-box, other use cases around platforms that will also emerge around consuming all this data and sharing all this data to find use cases that go beyond banking, and I think this is not very far now. We are seeing it in our online bank in France. We now have a full shopping store where you can shop for your travel, for your shoes, for everything you want, through the app in a very secure way.
Fantastic. Well, a lot of food for thought for the future. And some very interesting ideas, which no doubt we'll be on stage talking about next year. In the meantime, thanks very much, everyone, for coming. Please give a big hand to Claire and Hiroki for coming.
Thank you.